Here's something I want you to sit with for a second. Think about the last time you felt a flicker of attraction to someone who wasn't your partner. Or if you're not partnered right now, think about a moment when you found yourself genuinely drawn to more than one person at the same time. Now, notice what came right after that feeling. What happened in your body? What showed up in your chest, in your stomach, or in your throat? I'm going to guess it wasn't neutral curiosity. I'm going to guess it was something faster and louder than that. Guilt or shame, maybe a kind of panic. A quick internal mood to shut it down before the feeling could even finish forming. That speed is what I want to talk about today. Because we don't feel that kind of automatic, pre-thought shame over things we've consciously examined and freely chosen. We feel it over things that got put into us quietly, early, and without our consent, as the operating rules of how love is supposed to work. Before we ever had a chance to read the terms, monogamy, as most of us have received it, wasn't a choice, it was a default. And defaults are not the same as decisions. Welcome to Untamed Ember. I'm Dr. Misty. Today we're starting at the very beginning. Not the beginning of your relationship, and not the beginning of your question about what you want. The beginning of where the question got blocked, which is before you were old enough to ask it. We're talking about compulsory monogamy, the relationship structure most of us never actually selected, but have been living inside as though we did. And more importantly, we're talking about how that structure doesn't just live in your beliefs or your assumptions, it lives in your body, in the way your nervous system responds before your conscious mind has even caught up. That's what today is about, and that's where the real work starts. So let's dig in. Let me start with something I want you to really hear, because it's going to reframe everything else we talk about today. That guilt you feel when you notice an attraction to someone who isn't your partner, that tightening in your chest, that quick impulse to shut it down before the feeling can even finish forming, that is not your moral compass. That is a conditioned alarm, and there is a big difference. We tend to treat those responses as evidence of something about our character. Like the guilt means we know deep down that we did something wrong. But what if it just means the conditioning worked? Here's what I mean by that. Your nervous system learns through repetition, through reinforcement, through early experiences that happen before you have any language or critical thinking to examine them. You know this already from season 1. Patterns get installed, and the earlier they get installed, the more automatic they are, and the more they feel like just the way things are rather than something that was put there. Monogamy got installed that way for most of us. Not through a conversation you had, not through a choice you made, not through any kind of real examination of what you actually want. It was just running in the background, like an operating system you never selected before you ever saw a different screen. And here's the thing about ubiquity. It gets mistaken for nature. Monogamy is everywhere, so it feels natural. But everywhere is not the same as biological. Something can be deeply culturally universal and still be a construction. It can still be a script, still be something that was handed to you rather than something that grew from inside you. The guilt you feel isn't your conscience telling you something true about who you are. It's a social alarm that was calibrated before you could consent to the calibration. And that changes everything about how we work with it. So where did that calibration actually come from? Because it didn't just show up out of nowhere. It had a delivery mechanism. And the easiest way I know to show you that mechanism is to give you a specific moment, one that might sound familiar. So Lauren is 11 years old. She's on the couch with a parent, watching something on TV. It doesn't matter exactly what's on. What matters is that a character on screen is clearly drawn to two people at once. Nothing explicit, just emotionally obvious. And something shifts in the room. Her parent doesn't say anything dramatic. Maybe it's a sound or a small exhale or a particular quality of stillness. Maybe they change the channel. Maybe they just say something brief and move on. But Lauren gets the message. Clearly and completely, that feeling is wrong. That kind of person is not who we are. She doesn't get an explanation. She doesn't get a conversation, just the data. So there's actually a name for the system that made that room possible. And I think it's worth taking a moment to name it properly, because having language for something changes how you're able to work with it. The framework I'm drawing on comes from sociologist Adrienne Rich, who in 1980 wrote about something she called compulsory heterosexuality. Her argument wasn't that heterosexuality is bad or wrong. It was that it was compulsory in a very specific sense. Alternatives were systematically erased, pathologized, or penalized. It wasn't just a preference that most people happen to share. It was a mandate backed by real social and institutional consequences for stepping outside of it. Compulsory monogamy works exactly the same way. And it's worth sitting with that word, compulsory. We're not just talking about monogamy as a choice. We're talking about monogamy as the default that was never optional, the structure you were living inside before you ever got to decide whether it was yours. The burden of proof was never on the system, it was always on you. A philosopher named Elizabeth Brake took this further and gave us a term that I find genuinely useful. Amatonormativity. It's a mouthful, I know. But what it names is the cultural assumption that romantic, dyadic partnership, two people, committed, exclusive, primary, is the highest and most legitimate form of human relationship. And what Brake points to is that this isn't just a social preference. It's structurally built into how our society is organized. Tax law, hospital visitation rights, inheritance, insurance, social invitations, family pressure. When a system creates concrete material advantages for one relationship structure and treats everything else as deviant or incomplete, that's not neutral, which is what made Lauren's couch moment possible. It wasn't random. It wasn't just her family's particular values. It was a specific cultural infrastructure doing exactly what it was designed to do. And the way that infrastructure delivers its rules is worth understanding because it's the reason this conditioning is so hard to see. High control in religious cultures are often most effective at transmitting rules not through explicit instruction, but through atmosphere, through what isn't said, through the quality of someone's disapproval, the particular silence that follows certain things on screen, certain questions asked out loud, certain feelings that show up in the wrong place. And here's what makes that kind of transmission so hard to work with later. There's nothing to argue with. When a rule arrives explicitly, you can examine it, push back on it, decide whether it's yours. But when it arrives as a felt sense in a room, as a shift in the air, it doesn't feel like a rule someone gave you. It just feels like reality. Like that's just the way things are. So what makes the religious and high control version of this particularly deep is that the relationship structure didn't arrive just as a social pressure or a cultural norm. It arrived packaged inside something much heavier, what it means to be a good person, to be pure, to be worthy. When your relationship structure gets fused to your moral identity, the threat of questioning it isn't just social, it's existential. It doesn't just risk disapproval, it risks being fundamentally wrong as a person. And that kind of threat lives deep inside the nervous system. So Lauren is in her 30s now, and she left her high control upbringing years ago, and yet she still can't watch a scene like that without her chest tightening. If she left, why is it still there? And what does it actually take to change something that lives that deep? Let's talk about why that is. Why leaving the culture doesn't automatically take the conditioning with it. Because this is the thing that confuses people the most, and it's also the thing that changes everything about how we do this work. When something gets reinforced enough times, with enough emotional charge, and especially when it's attached to the threat of social or moral consequences, it doesn't just stay in your thoughts. It becomes a body pattern. The nervous system learns to respond to certain stimuli in specific ways. And that learning, it isn't stored in your beliefs or your opinions. It's stored in your muscles, your gut, your chest, your throat. It becomes a physiological habit that runs before your conscious mind has time to weigh in. Think about what actually happened in Lauren's body in that room when she was 11. Her nervous system was doing exactly what nervous systems do, taking in data from the environment, registering the emotional signal from her parent, and learning what that signal meant. What it learned was, this feeling is dangerous. This kind of attraction is a threat to my safety, my belonging, my worth as a person. That's not a thought, that's a survival response. And survival responses don't go away when you update your beliefs. They go away when your nervous system has had enough new experiences of safety to actually relearn what the stimulus means. So this is where the Polyvagal framework is really useful. When something activates what we might call the attachment threat system, meaning anything the nervous system reads as a potential disruption to your sense of belonging, your sense of being acceptable, your sense of being safe in your relationships, the body moves out of its window of tolerance. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your nervous system is just doing its job. The problem isn't the feeling of attraction. The problem is what the system has been conditioned to believe that feeling means. And you cannot think your way out of a body pattern. You can understand compulsory monogamy as a concept on a Tuesday afternoon and still feel the full shame spiral on Wednesday morning when the alarm fires. That's not failure. That's just how conditioning works. And there's a specific somatic signature that goes along with this particular kind of conditioning. You might recognize it. Shame that arrives before you've done anything. A kind of contraction, a pulling inward, a desire to make yourself smaller or to hide the feeling before anyone can see it. Hypervigilance in your relationships, a low-grade constant monitoring of your own inner life to make sure you're doing it right. Those aren't individual quirks or personal neuroses. They're the completely predictable physiological signature of living inside of a system that has been telling you since before you could read that your desires are suspect and your instincts need policing. And sitting right at the center of that somatic signature is something I want to name very precisely because the words matter here. Getting this distinction wrong is actually one of the main reasons people stay stuck. The distinction between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. Guilt is about behavior, and shame is about identity. And they feel different in the body. Guilt has a quality of wanting to repair something, to make it right, or to do better. Shame has a quality of wanting to disappear, of wanting to not be seen, of a kind of collapsing inward that isn't about fixing anything. It's about surviving exposure. So what most people with this particular conditioning experience isn't guilt, it's shame. And the clinical tell is the speed. When the feeling arrives and the response is immediate, automatic, and pre-thought, that isn't moral reasoning happening. That's a conditioned alarm. You haven't done anything yet. You haven't even finished having the feeling, and the shutdown is already running. What follows the alarm is the self-monitoring loop. And this is the part that's exhausting in a very specific way. Once the shame fires, the surveillance begins. Am I spending too much time noticing this? What does it mean that I felt that? Is something wrong with me? Am I a bad partner? A bad person? The loop is relentless and it's costly, not just emotionally, but physiologically. Being in conflict with your own interior experience takes enormous energy. It's the cost of bracing against yourself. When Lauren came into therapy, she spent a long time trying to figure out what was wrong with her. Not what was unsatisfying in her life, not what she actually wanted. What was specifically broken in her, that she kept having these feelings even though she'd left the church, she'd left her high control culture, even though she didn't believe any of it anymore, even though she knew intellectually that attraction was normal and human and not a moral verdict. She had completely internalized the frame. If I still feel this, something in me hasn't been fixed yet. The therapeutic work wasn't reassurance. It wasn't telling her that everyone feels this way, because that tends to land as dismissal rather than relief. It was slower than that. It was helping Lauren see that her nervous system was doing something completely coherent given what it had been taught. The feeling wasn't the problem. The meaning the system had attached to the feeling was the problem. And those are two very different things to work with. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking at this point, because there's a version of the pushback to all of this that I hear, and it deserves a real answer rather than a dismissal. The pushback goes something like this. Isn't some of this just natural? Don't humans have evolved tendencies toward pair bonding, toward jealousy, toward protective attachment? If we're doing somatic work, if we take the body seriously, shouldn't we take those signals seriously too? Isn't calling all of it conditioning just a way of dismissing something that might actually be biological? Here's what I actually believe about that. Yes, attachment is biological. Humans absolutely have evolved tendencies toward pair bonding. The neuroscience is real. Oxytocin, vasopressin, the reward circuitry involved in primary bonding, none of that is made up. But biology does not determine form. Lots of things are biological without being prescriptive about the specific structure they have to take. Aggression is biological. We still have cultural norms and legal structures that shape how it gets expressed. Sexual attraction is biological. It doesn't arrive in a culturally neutral form. The question isn't whether pair bonding instincts exist. The question is whether the specific form of compulsory monogamy, the singular, lifelong, exclusive dyadic partnership as the only valid and legitimate structure is correctly attributed to biology, or whether we're using evolutionary framing to naturalize something that is substantially culturally constructed, historically specific, and institutionally enforced. But here's the counter-argument I genuinely respect. There's a real case to be made that some people's nervous systems and attachment styles genuinely organize around a primary dyadic bond in a way that isn't just conditioning. It's temperament. It's authentic preference. And calling all of that compulsory risks doing to monogamous people exactly what compulsory monogamy does to non-monogamous people, treating their natural inclinations as suspect, as something that needs to be explained or justified. That deserves a fair hearing. Not all monogamy is compulsory. Some people genuinely examine their options and land on monogamy as the structure that's right for them. This episode is not an argument against monogamy. It's an argument against monogamy as the unexamined mandatory default. And here's where I'm going to be honest about where the tension stays alive for me. For any given person, it's genuinely hard to separate what is biological temperament, what is genuine examined preference, and what is conditioned compliance. That disentanglement isn't clean. It may not always be possible. We may not always be able to tell. And I think that naming that uncertainty is more useful than pretending this work gives us a clean answer, because it truly doesn't. I don't think you need to resolve that today for yourself. Sitting with it is the work. The question isn't whether you're monogamous because you're broken or because you're conditioned. The question is, have you actually asked yourself? Have you had enough space, enough safety, enough real information to find out? And that's really the only question worth sitting with from here. Not a verdict, just an opening. I want to say something directly because I know some of you are sitting with a fair amount of anxiety right now. Questioning compulsory monogamy is not the same as deciding you want to be non-monogamous. It's not a sign that your relationship is failing, and it's not an announcement that you're about to blow up your life. That conflation, the idea that asking the question means you've already decided the answer, is itself part of the conditioning. One of the ways compulsory monogamy stays intact is by making the question feel as threatening as the conclusion. So the first thing I want to say clearly is you can hold this question and not change anything. The inquiry is not the conclusion. And then the second thing I want to say is that even if you do want to examine this, even if you do decide that your relationship structure deserves a real look, that work doesn't happen primarily in your head. You can listen to this episode and update your beliefs and still feel the full shame spiral tomorrow morning. Not because the work didn't land, because this kind of conditioning doesn't respond to intellectual updating alone. It responds to new experiences repeated over time that teach the nervous system a different meaning for the stimulus. That takes time. It takes support. It often requires more than just thinking new thoughts. So Lauren didn't leave her relationship. She didn't open it up, though she eventually had a real conversation with her partner about what she was learning about herself, which is its own kind of brave. What changed was more interior than any of that. She stopped treating her own inner life as evidence of moral failure. She started being able to notice attraction without it triggering a crisis response. The feeling didn't disappear, but it stopped functioning as a threat to her identity because she'd started actually examining what her identity was, rather than just defending the default that had been handed to her. That's what unlearning looks like. It's quieter than people expect. It doesn't always show up in your relationship structure at all. Sometimes it just shows up as being able to sit with yourself without bracing. And if I'm going to leave you with one concrete thing today, it's this. The question I want to leave you with today is not, are you monogamous or should you be? Those are downstream questions, and they may not even be the right ones yet. The upstream question is this. When did you actually choose your relationship structure? Not when did you enter it? Not when did you default into it because it was the available option, the expected thing, or the path of least resistance? When did you actually sit with real information and real space and enough nervous system safety to actually ask yourself what you want? If you don't have a clear answer to that, that's not a crisis, but it's an invitation. And here's what I want you to consider over the coming days. When you hold that question, what happens in your body? Not what you think about it. What happens physically? Is there something that feels like relief, like finally having a name for something that you've been carrying? Is there anxiety? A quick impulse to dismiss it and move on? A tightening somewhere that you weren't expecting? Whatever shows up is information. You don't have to act on it. You don't have to tell anyone, and you don't have to decide anything today. But getting curious about your own interior response rather than bracing against it or shutting it down is actually where this work starts. Next episode, we're going somewhere that might feel more charged than today did: jealousy. Not as a moral verdict, not as evidence that something is wrong with you or your relationship, but as a nervous system event. What it's actually doing, what it's actually protecting, and what it takes to work with it rather than just white-knuckling through it. So before we close, I want to give you somewhere to land with this. Take a moment right now, wherever you are. You don't have to close your eyes if that doesn't feel comfortable. Just let your body settle in a little. Notice the weight of your seat and the temperature of the air. The simple fact that you're here. Notice what's happening in your body right now. There might be a lot going on in there. This topic has a way of reaching into things we've actually kept carefully contained. If you're feeling some activation right now, some tightening in your chest, anxiety that you can't quite place, I want to gently name that makes sense. You just spent time with something your nervous system may have been taught to treat as threatening. This discomfort isn't a signal that something is wrong. It might be a signal that you got too close to something true. So here's the question that I want to leave you with. Not to answer it right now, not to turn it into a decision or a plan, just to hold it somewhere in the back of your mind and see what it does over the next few days. When you think about your relationship structure, whether you're in one or imagining one, is there a felt sense that it's actually yours? Not just familiar and not just expected, not just the option that would cause the least friction or require the least conversation, but actually yours, something you've genuinely examined and claimed. If you feel a clear yes to that, then sit with it. Notice where you feel it in your body and let that be real. If something more complicated showed up, something you've been trying not to name, I want you to know that's not an emergency. You don't have to act on it. You don't have to tell anyone. You don't have to change anything today. But you're allowed to be curious about your own interior life. That's not disloyalty to anyone. That's just what the work looks like from the inside. And if this is the first time anyone has framed it quite this way, if no one has ever handed you this question before, I want you to know that it's incredibly common. We're taught not to ask, which is, of course, the whole point of today. This has been Untamed Ember. I'm Dr. Misty. Welcome to Season 2. Today, we named something most of us have been living inside without ever being handed the name for it. Compulsory monogamy is not a verdict on your relationship. It's not a judgment on monogamy itself. It's an invitation to finally get to decide for yourself. Subscribe to the Untamed Ember newsletter at untamedember.kit.com for deep dives, bonus material, and the behind-the-scenes content that does not make it into the episode. Next episode, we're talking about jealousy as a nervous system event, not a moral failure, not a relationship verdict, an event. We'll look at what it's actually doing and how to work with it. I'll see you next time.